Hello, I'm Khoi, and boy, this is a really good turnout. Josh is looking around saying lots and lots of organs.
That's right, that's right.
So when he's not speaking at writers' festivals like this, our guest does stuff that just a few decades ago would be considered the stuff of science fiction, really dark science fiction, because he takes parts from one person and he sticks them in another. His book, when Death Becomes Life, it tracks the history of this fascinating field of transplant surgery, and you're exposed to the tremendous brilliance and conviction of visionary medical pioneers, the faith and courage of desperately sick patients, the magnificent generosity of donors and their families. And he also weaves in his own story. It's like, you remember The Making of the Surgeon by William Nolan? That was like a big thing in the 70s. And Dr. Mezrich weaves in his own personal odyssey through medical school at Cornell, surgical residency at Chicago, transplant research at Massachusetts General Hospital, and to his current destination, current place at the University of Wisconsin. So it's, and he invites the reader into the OR, on rounds, into organ allocation meetings, and he really brings us into the patient's lives as well as into their bodies. So these stories that he tells are told with, they're both heartbreaking and heartwarming, and they're told with humor, with candor, and above all, I think, with a tone of kindness that I really loved in the book. And so please welcome Dr. Joshua Mezrich.
Thank you.
Josh, so how did you stumble into or decide you wanted to be a transplant surgeon?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's incredible to be here. What a wonderful event. I'm so excited to be a part of this. So I probably wasn't someone any of my friends would have expected would go into surgery. I couldn't draw a straight line with a T-square. I was kind of a messy kid. I didn't build model airplanes. But I loved science. I loved to read. In many ways, I stumbled into medical school. My dad had gone back to medical school when I was in third grade, and I watched him go through his training, and I was fascinated by that. I also loved Hawkeye Pierce from MASH, and I wanted to be a meatball surgeon. That was like the thing. I don't know what that is, but I'd still tell people that's what I am. And I love humor, obviously. And I went to medical school, and I thought I'd be a pediatric oncologist because I liked kids. I thought I could make them laugh. The victories would be so sweet. Obviously, the failures would be so hard, but it was something I thought I might do. And then my first day on my surgery rotation as a medical student, we got in around 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning. We're writing notes, found out I was on call, which was a good preparation for the rest of my life. Don't make any plans. And had this crazy day. I was in the OR all day. I didn't eat or drink anything because I was too scared. And I remember around 10 o'clock at night, I was scrubbed in on a bowel obstruction, and I was sweating, and I felt like I was going to throw up. I was hanging on the bowels, trying not to fall down or have a bowel movement. It's weird how those things all come together. And I got through it, and then around midnight, my chief resident said, "Hey, go scrub into the room next door." And all I wanted to do was go home. I was so tired, I had no interest, but I'm the good trooper. I went in there, and it was a kidney transplant, and this older surgeon, Dr. Stubenboard, was doing a deceased donor kidney, and he had classical music playing, and I stood there, and I was just cutting sutures, too long or too short. That's the old medical school joke. And when he released the clamps and this kidney turned pink with the music playing and the urine started squirting out, I thought, this is the most incredible thing I've ever seen. This shouldn't work. And I wondered how, what other organs can we do this with? I knew that someone had just died and given this gift, and I thought, I want to be a part of this. I wonder if I can do this. That's something that's always been interesting to me. Can I do this? Can I master this? Can I be a part of this? So that was really the moment.
And this moment happened at midnight, right?
Yeah.
So that kind of speaks to like a time constraint from the time the organ is procured. And what is that time?
Yeah, I mean, it varies with each organ. And an interesting thing about deceased donor, not living donor organs is you can take a little time to get them in, but the longer you take to get in, the more likely it won't start working right away. So if you're doing a heart transplant or a lung transplant, you want to get them in very quickly because it's not good if the heart doesn't start beating when you sew it in. With a liver, similarly, when we sew a liver in, if it doesn't start working, the patient just continues to bleed, and we'll literally pack the patient and sit around in the lounge and watch TV until it kicks in. With a kidney, where we have dialysis, you can wait a little bit longer because it doesn't need to start working right away, although it's better if it does. So I usually think with a heart, you want to get it in about 6 hours. With a liver, 8 hours. With a kidney, oh my gosh, I've done kidneys at 48 hours. But the earlier, the better. In terms of it kicking in, which makes it easier to manage the patient.
And your book starts with you sitting on a plane going to procure an organ. So it's the center that's going to implant the organ that sends its own people out to procure.
That's right. So I always knew when I decided to write the book that I was going to start it and end it on an airplane, because I think it does capture this sense of adventure and excitement that's part of what transplant is. And I also know a bunch of my friends who I grew up with had no idea that we actually fly out for these organs. And it's really fun, it's exciting. We get to know these pilots who are so proud to be a part of it. Weather is often an issue, and I knew I was going to start it with a thunderstorm because I have had the unfortunate experience of flying in some thunderstorms. And it can be actually quite frightening. I start out with this really terrible flight, but what I didn't include in this story is that after we landed, the pilot said to me, I prefer to fly freight. And I said, why? And he said, because freight doesn't scream. And I was like, okay. Right. We had one flight where
Speaking of making urine,
I know. There was plenty of urine made on that airplane.
Everybody's kidneys were working. So when you get to that procurement place, Josh, is the procurement team typically meeting with the donor's family?
Yeah, I love talking about this. So when I wrote the book, I really wanted to celebrate our donors. And I think one of the really special things about transplant is that we have donors. In other areas of medicine, you try to fight off death, delay death, or maybe give someone a better death, which is obviously a wonderful thing. But in transplant, we start with death. Yeah. We take this gift, this legacy, and we give life with it. And the donors are as much my patients as the recipients. The first time I went on a procurement, I was a trainee, I was a fellow, and we got out there in Green Bay, and the team said, okay, let's go talk to the donor family. And I was horrified. I thought they're going to look at me as this vulture who's come to, take the parts of their loved one. That couldn't have been further from the truth. The family hung on to every word that we said. They wanted to know everything about it. Where were the organs going? Were they going into a Packers fan? Not a Bears fan, hopefully. Would it happen tonight? Could they meet them? And then they wanted to know about the procedure, what would happen. And at the end of it, we hugged every one of them. They just were so thankful that we were going to allow their loved one to give this gift. And I write about this in our group. We do when we start the procurement, we do a moment of silence and think about what it is we're doing here. And then our coordinator will read something, typically that the family gave us. It may be a poem or a prayer. It may be something that the person who died loved to do. Maybe a team they loved, which in Wisconsin is always the same team. Maybe a place they like to go, something about their children or who they were leaving behind. And we're all like, tearing up, thinking about our own children. But then we have to shift to the task at hand. Surgery to me is like a puzzle. You focus on the puzzle and you've got to solve that puzzle. And some puzzles are 10 pieces and they're really easy, and some are like 1,000,000 pieces. But that shift is really fascinating.
So my team, about a year ago, got called in to do an emergency angiogram on a weekend. It was a 58-year-old woman who was an artist, and she slipped in the shower. She hit her head, and now they asked us to come in and do an angiogram to see if her heart would be suitable to be used. And even though we've done thousands of these, just being in the room with this person who was passing, but who had chosen to have her heart give life to some. Our team was so moved. We gathered together and we said a prayer beforehand, and tried to acknowledge this passage, and and so it was so moving in your book. You know, these donors, right? By and large, they're people who are healthy, because you wouldn't be a donor if you weren't healthy, and they're doing great. And then there's that icy highway, or a slip off a ladder, or this fall in the shower, and you write about like a kid playing with a toy that gets stuck in his windpipe, and that, oh my God, to be in that moment.
Yeah, I mean, that story is incredibly moving. This beautiful family, and this a small child got a little thumbtack stuck in his airway. It was exactly the size of his airway, and at first it seemed like something that wasn't going to be a big deal, and then led to the death of this child. And they were able to give all of the organs, and the family's still struggling with that, of course. But I think it is true. Sometimes these donations happen when it was a completely normal day, and something that is meaningless happens, attack, or you slip on the ice, or you fall down the stairs. The worst is going up on your roof to clean your roof. Do not do that. We have tons of donors from that. And some are the motorcycle accidents. No, it's true. Clean it never. That's one of my many excuses for not doing chores. It's too dangerous. Can't shovel.
I bet we don't have too many roof cleaners.
Oh, that's right. And you don't shovel snow either. But yeah, some of this happens on the normalest of days, and none of us know. So it does make you cherish the time you have. But I do believe I've met with so many donor families, and the donation at least gives them something to remember that's positive, and it's helped so many families to live on. But there's tragedy. It's
the way you described the family saying goodbye to their son with reading his favorite bedtime story, and anyway.
That has to be the toughest story. And we were on a procurement, and it was a child who had developed a throat infection and died. Totally healthy, a beautiful little boy, and the family brought him in with the stuffed animals, and they held the child and read, played the bedtime music and read the story, and all of us were crying. And then they, placed the child back down, and then we had to run in and do our part. And that is obviously very difficult to control your emotions, but I do think it's an incredible privilege to be a part of that and to be able to help give this gift. And it's so important that we do it right.
Wait, so just to switch a little bit, so now you start the procurement process, and do you have multiple teams, each one going after getting their elbows up, or what's that like?
Then there's the machismo of surgeons trying to prove they're the alpha male. I'm not the alpha in my family, by the way. All my kids know that. My wife is here, and she's clearly the alpha. But in the OR, we try to, and she's a surgeon as well. So, but in the OR, we all try to vie for our position. So we'll often, if it's particularly a young donor, we'll have a lot of teams there. So there might be a cardiac team, or even 2 teams if a different team's getting the lungs and the heart.
Are you working side by side, or are you taking turns?
We're side by side. And then usually there's one abdominal team. Sometimes an additional team will come in as well. And so there are a lot of people around the table. We'll have some students. And we have to coordinate it, because we have to get everything ready, but then the time comes where we have to do the cross clamp and let the blood out. And we all want all the organs to get used, but there's always a negotiation. The cardiac guys try to cut the cava lower, and we try to push their hands up. We always protect the liver. We're like, you don't need that. The heart's just a pump anyway, so you probably don't like that.
No.
The heart just pumps blood to the more interesting organs like the liver and the kidney, the more cerebral organs.
Now I'm totally lost.
Flustered?
Yeah. So while you're doing this, when does the call go out to the recipients?
We like to say kind of transplant, particularly organ allocation, is all logistics. It's like, what can Brown do for you, or whatever. There are so many balls in the air. So we find out about donors usually well in advance, a few days in advance, and that's when the phone calls start coming. So the organ procurement organization is triggered when a patient comes in meeting certain criteria that is approaching death, and then we start running lists, placing organs, doing tests on the donor like the cardiac catheterization to see which organs we can use. Once we know what's going to be used, the teams start getting identified, we bring the recipients in, we start setting up travel plans, we look at the weather, and then we often have to time it with what other operations are going on at that donor hospital. So you can imagine it generates a crazy amount of work, a crazy amount of phone calls. Patients come in, sometimes the organ's a no-go, they go back home. It's an incredible amount of effort, and we have like a city of people that work on our team.
It must be wonderful, though, to make that call to somebody.
It is.
Who's waiting, and you say, we have something for you.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. Think about this. Imagine you're sitting there waiting on a list, and you feel like crap, and you're afraid you're going to die because you might, and then you get this call, and you're so, your life has been saved, but you also know somebody has just died. And I think that is just so incredible. And when we fly back and we meet the recipients maybe before we go in the OR, they always have a big crowd of people because people have been waiting with them. And they always know, they're so excited, but they know that there was a tragedy that happened. And it does represent the best in humanity. I think in this world that we live in right now, it's wonderful to be a part of something where you see these heroic acts. To me, the donors are like people who run into a burning building to save someone. It's just a beautiful gift. And the recipients are so thankful for that. And honestly, it's a privilege to be a part of that. And maybe we're just the ones who do the gift wrapping and transfer the gift, but it's really a beautiful thing.
You know, with modern medicine now, if you have kidney failure, you can be on dialysis. And if you have heart failure, there are these incredible artificial devices which assist the failing heart and their medication. So you can kind of tune these people up. But for liver transplants, we don't have currently a lot of things. And when you talk about calling someone in and they're aware that someone else has gone down and maybe left this gift, but you say some of these patients, you're not sure they can make it through, so you call in a backup recipient. And what is going through that backup recipient's mind? Because they need two people.
Right. And they know that. They're like, I want to get this liver, but I don't want someone else to have to die, another person to have to die. The liver is a particularly fascinating and complex organ, and many people thought it could never be transplanted because it has such complicated blood flow. The father of liver transplant, Tom Starzl, is he died recently, but one of the most fascinating people ever. And I do love the liver, but one of the things I love about it is the name. And when I text my wife and say, I'm not going to be home tonight, I have a liver, my phone always switches it to lover. And so we have an ongoing joke about, I guess if I ever get a lover, I'm in good shape.
So, liver transplant. So,
I have a liver transplant.
But some of these liver operations, and you talk about, you know, these people, the liver drains 30 feet of intestines, right? So you got all these blood vessels coming in, and then the liver that fails and scars down and hardens, all these vessels get backed up so they get engorged and fragile. And then also the liver, maybe people don't realize, is where clotting factors are made. So when you have someone with liver failure, ironically, it's the people who need the operation the most that are least likely to survive an operation.
Yeah, I mean, most surgeons won't touch someone with liver disease, and the person who trained me, Munshi Kalaylı, who's a Turkish surgeon, always said, you know, the only operation you should be doing on a patient with liver failure is a liver transplant. Even the smallest operations can be very, very scary and bloody. And because, like you said, the liver gets all scarred and cirrhotic, blood can't get through it, so it backs up, and you form these gigantic varices or blood vessels that are just engorged with blood, and they're very thin-walled. It's like a balloon. Not to mention, they don't make any clotting factors. So some livers, you can go in, and from the start to finish, you have 3 suckers going. Anesthesia is working. We always blame anesthesia for everything, but they're a huge part of our team. And I've done livers where we've lost 150 liters of blood. And if you picture, you might have 5-7 liters in your body. That's sort of an insane amount.
So if you're not metric, okay? So if you were to drain me of all my blood, you'd get less than 1.5 gallons of blood out of me, okay? And what you're talking about is someone going through maybe over 20 gallons of blood in a case.
And they're not all like that, but some of them can be. It takes a real team, and it takes incredible perseverance to kind of keep your cool and keep your team working together when things aren't going well, when you're having intense blood loss. It's also incredibly humbling. There's no place for, I mean, I know surgeons are known as these kind of cocky creatures. But there's really no place for pride in the operating room. I always try to think I want to treat this patient like I would want my mom treated. But I never hesitate to call for help, to communicate with the room that things aren't going well, to be honest about my own shortcomings. And I wanted to write a book that was also very honest about that. And we have a great team. It requires a team to do these operations.
So still, after all these years of doing it, it must be such a thrill when that organ pinks up again.
It
Even
really is.
Since the days of being a medical student, it's still, that thrill must never get old.
It doesn't. I mean, I still think this shouldn't work, and it is incredible. Now, it is true when you're doing the job, some of it can become like a job, right? You're like, oh, I don't want to do another kidney, and you can sometimes forget. You're tired, and you forget someone's getting this incredible gift. I will tell you that writing this book really reinvigorated my excitement about this gift, and my colleagues as well. And just remembering this is really one of the most amazing accomplishments of, it's like landing a man on the moon, I think. Like transplant was science fiction in the 40s and 50s. It was a really bad option until 1983 when cyclosporin got approved. So over a really short period of time, we went from total science fiction to having this incredibly reliable treatment, and the field continues to grow like that. So it's really exciting to be a part of that, and it happened on the backs of some people that just believed it was going to happen.
And it's such a great operation now. Maybe people don't have an idea how long these organs now last, and so the average kidney, give us an idea of the longevity of these transplanted organs.
I think one thing to remember is this isn't an area of medicine where we just want to get people out to a nursing home or, where they lie in a bed and when our patients do well, they live a vibrant, normal life. They travel, they work, they do whatever it is they want to do. And the outcomes are really good, but they're not perfect. So like for a kidney, the 1-year survival is better than 95%. With a living donor kidney, it's like 98%. And the half-life, meaning the point where we would have lost maybe half of the organs, but half are going strong for a kidney, is probably on order of 15 to 18 years. Now remember, transplant didn't get good until 83, so like we still don't even know some of this. A heart, similarly, I mean,
it's like a decade, right?
A decade is a good, solid outcome. I think we're getting more and more people who are doing even better, and it's going to continue to improve. And again, these people aren't just barely getting by. I mean, they're living real lives, and it's incredible. I think we're going to continue to get better.
And livers are about 20 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think with liver, it's all about getting through the early part. So the patients are there's no example of medicine, in my opinion, where you take someone who's so ridiculously sick, like you can barely look at them, and then you do this huge operation, and like if things go well, a few days later, they're like, hey doc, I feel great. It's really remarkable. And most of the danger with liver is in that early period. So like 1% die on the table, which is a really low number, but it's not zero. The 1-year survival is something like 90%, so 10% do die. But if you can avoid a problem in the first 6 months, you can easily get 15, 20 years, or be that far out and be totally fine. So
pretty miraculous. So that must be so cool to go out to the waiting room, and you've got this patient and the family, and they've been living in the shadow of chronic and or critical disease for so long, and to tell them that that must be. But unfortunately, we're doctors. We don't have like a balance sheet of emotions, right? So like 10 gratifying results somehow doesn't get balanced out. It doesn't balance out the one disastrous outcome or the.
That's so true. I mean, I think one of the hardest things about being any type of medical caregiver, but certainly in my field, is that you definitely focus on the patients who have problems, because that's where you're putting all your effort, that's where your emotions are, that's what's agonizing you or keeping you up at night. And I think the hardest part is managing that and coping with that. And the good outcomes don't take away the tragedies. I wanted to write really honestly about some of that. I have, of course, a chapter on complications because, that's the most important thing. But I think managing that, I include this in my book, this anecdote, but I think every surgeon, probably this applies to everyone in healthcare, but every surgeon needs to have a box, and a metaphorical box. And in that box, you put your complications. You need to be able to open that box so you can be honest about it, admit it, learn from it, be there for the patient, be able to tell them, we're gonna fight through this together, I'm sorry this happened. But you also need to be able to close that box. So when you go home with your family, you're not constantly, I can't believe this happened, you're constantly checking on your patient, you can't be there for your kids. I know surgeons who can't open that box and they're cavalier and they're not good. But I also know surgeons who can't close that box, and they tend to leave the field. Or
it's hard to close that box.
It's extremely hard. And my wife and I lie awake at night thinking about this. I think we both thought when we were training that the hard part would be learning these operations. How am I ever going to be able to figure out how to do this complex operation? And we looked at these people who above us and thought, I'll never be like that. But that's actually not true. The hard part, for sure, is managing the worry, managing the complications. And you think like some of these more senior people, it doesn't bother them. I think of some of my senior partners and think they don't worry about it, they're so good. It's totally not true. Even the toughest surgeons struggle. And when you ask these older surgeons when they're retiring, what's the best part about retiring, it's never like I can go play golf or I can come out to the desert, which does seem pretty good. But it's usually they say, it's going to be so great not to have to worry every day.
So, Josh, first of all, I need you to move your right foot because I can't see the clock.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And then
we
secondly,
have hours left.
Secondly, with that in mind, that makes it so hard for me to understand how the early guys, the Starzls and the Gibbons and the Murrays, so they were just faced with failure after failure and death after death. How do they keep going?
This is a big part of my book because there have been some histories written about transplant, but I knew this was the last opportunity to really spend time with these people who were still alive and not ask them what they did, but how were they able to persist? Because it's easy to think, oh, it worked out, it must have been so great. But they had patient after patient just dying in their hands. They had people around them calling them murderers, writing petitions to get them out of the field. Physicians not referring them any donors because they thought they were just desecrating these corpses or whatever. And they persisted. And I wanted to understand how. Now, some people will say, well, if you had liver failure in the 50s, 60s, you were going to die anyways. If you had kidney failure, you were going to die anyways. So it doesn't seem like that big of a deal. I totally disagree with that, because having had people die in my hands, it doesn't matter that they were sick or that they were going to die anyways. It's still absolutely brutal to experience that and to have to go tell the family and to have to feel those shortcomings and wonder if you could have done something better.
Yeah, it doesnst seem like it justifies it, because for the patient, certainly they were going to die anyway, but dying on the table or a post-operative death, infection, rejection, and they were really deprived of a very different sort of passage.
Absolutely, absolutely. Every one of these pioneers had a different coping mechanism, some healthy, some not. So some were religious, some used humor, which is definitely my coping mechanism, some used alcohol, which is not a great coping mechanism. Sometimes it works. But like Tom Starzl, who's one of my personal heroes, who's the father of liver transplant, he dragged that field on his back and made it work. But he was the most tortured individual. He did not have a coping mechanism, and he remembered everything, every patient, every stitch. And he suffered throughout his life. He was almost paralyzed thinking about cases, thinking about all the children, because he did a lot of children who died. And he was kind of this angry dinosaur in the OR, but I think part of that was because he carried so much on his shoulders.
He did the first transplant in 1963, Benny Solis, and he wrote this thing afterwards, and I read it again the other night, and his description of Benny, a 3-year-old boy who then died in the operating room on the table. And he wasn't unaffected by it. He talks about the nurse, the weeping nurse covering the body with a white sheet, and the surgeon sitting around on stools looking at the ground, looking at hands until the people are cleaning the room and they're still sitting there. And so just to put in perspective, he did the first one in '63, right? But he didn't have a long-term survivor until 5 years later.
67, yeah.
So he 4 years of failure after failure and death after death.
And that long-term, they define long-term survival as 1 year survival. So these are kids, children, babies they're operating on. So he and Franny Moore and a couple of people in Europe were the only people doing transplants, liver transplants at this point, and all of the patients were dying mostly on the table. And he wrote this book, The Puzzle People, which I highly recommend. It's a beautiful book. It's his autobiography. But I think that scene where he writes about how everyone's looking at him and the blood is on the floor and no one leaves the room, I totally, that really speaks to me. When you have a patient die, you know, it's so tragic for everyone, and people are looking at you as the surgeon to kind of read what you're going to do, and they have sympathy for you, but you're also still kind of the captain of the ship, and you're trying to set the stage for the team to keep moving on. And we don't have the experience Tom Starzl had now. It's not, I don't want all you people to be afraid of getting a liver transplant, because it's not like this for everyone.
But to appreciate what they went through.
What they went through. I just, you know, one thing I want to mention, because we're talking about them, I really wanted to understand how they persisted. And there was a book written by a sociologist called The Courage to Fail. And she had followed around Starzl and other transplant surgeons and was trying to understand the same thing. And she wrote that these surgeons had the courage to fail. A bunch of the surgeons had the Teddy Roosevelt quote about, you know, rather being bloodied in the battlefield.
The man in the fray.
Which I think is a really great
In the arena.
one.
In the
arena. I know there are people here who know that quote.
A lot of readers here.
Yeah, but I do think, sure, they had the courage to fail. But my opinion is, like so many of us have the courage to fail. Anyone that is in our business, is in business, you know, has the courage to fail. I think they actually had the courage to succeed. They knew no matter what, this was going to work out. I mean, when you talk to Starzl, he was like, yeah, I always knew this was going to work out. It just couldn't be any other way. And I think when you talk to Norm Shumway or Lillehei, the heart surgeons, or Joe Murray, they knew in the end this was going to work out. And that, to me, was more powerful than the courage to fail. Yes, they definitely had the courage to fail, but they had the courage to persist, follow this through, you know, shut out the people that were doubting them. And to me, that was maybe their biggest characteristic.
But some didn't, right? And you talk about Gibbon, who worked for 20 years on a heart-lung machine so you could do open heart surgery, and he goes, and finally in the 1950s, he's got something that works after 20 years. And his first 4 cases, one person dies. 3 people died one day, and he says, "I'm done."
So Gibbons' a fascinating character. He probably, like me, was misplaced in surgery. He loved literature and poetry, and ended up in the field of, well, he started really the field of cardiac surgery. And of course, cardiac surgeons, I hate to say it, are like the beasts of the world, right? They always are proving how tough they are. I almost went into cardiac, but just because I wanted to be tough too. So Gibbons spent, 20 or more years of his career working on cardiac bypass, from when he was a student and watched a patient die from a pulmonary embolism, and he devoted his whole career to it. He ended up really succeeding and making the first bypass machine, which saved so many lives and changed the world. But when it came time to actually use it, he didn't really want to do it. And he like you said, I think he did 4 patients and only 1 survived, 3 died. And he was like, that's it, I'm not doing this anymore.
He was only 49.
He was only 49. He still did surgery, but he stopped using bypass. And he didn't really have the heart, if you will, to take these patients to the operating room and have them die. He handed it off to some other famous heart surgeons who persisted. And I believe Gibbons still deserves to be considered, the father of open heart surgery or cardiopulmonary bypass. But all of these other heart surgeons kind of poo-poo it and say, oh, he didn't have the guts to follow it through. And there is something to be said for that. I mean, it's a team effort. It doesn't have to be one person. But he believed in the technology, and then he was happy to pass it on and know that someone else would bring it to fruition. Because like all new things in medicine, probably other fields, there's getting over that initial hump, but then there's that learning curve of learning how to use it. And that's probably the most painful part of innovation. I think about the Wright brothers. I loved reading I believe it was a McCullough book about the Wright brothers. But I think it was similar to that, where there were all these people trying to fly planes and no one could do it. But once Orville and Wilbur figured out how to fly, all of a sudden like 100 people jumped out of the woodwork and started flying planes, and they crashed a lot of them, and they had to figure out, how to do it. And that was a little bit like this. He got it over the hump, but then he actually handed it off to others. And some heart surgeons don't like to call him, don't like to give him credit.
So, in your book, I think you so well outlined that there were 3 sets of challenges. There was the technical challenge of just figuring out how to hook up organs, right, and where to put them. And then you had the immunologic challenge of dealing with rejection. And then you had all this kind of ethical challenge. But the kidney thing, I didn't realize that when they first started doing it, they couldn't figure out where to put the kidney.
Yeah.
They were like putting it on the arm and the thigh. And
so I think the early part of transplant was figuring out the operations, like you said. Oh, yes.
So because you couldn't figure, so people realized, well, why is it hard to put the kidney? And I thought, well, people don't know what a kidney looks like. So I thought I would. Now, don't get nervous.
A real kidney,
you don't have to get nervous if a doctor's not wearing gloves, okay? As long as the doctor's wearing gloves, you're okay. Puts on gloves, you better start running. So I didn't. So what I did is I just went to the grocery store, and I thought this would kind of give people an idea. So this is kind of roughly a little small, but not too bad, right, for a kidney?
Yeah, roughly? I think so. I like to think of kidneys like a burrito, but they're a little bit more oblong. But this is about right. Bigger people have bigger organs. Sometimes the size of your fist. Some people would say.
Heart.
That's a really good heart.
It's a pretty good heart, isn't it?
Yeah, that's actually quite good.
Yeah. And
we do have to think about size, by the way. So like for, say, a liver or a heart, if you have a really big donor, you have to think about, can you fit it into a small recipient? For a kidney, we can always shove it in there.
Pancreas? Especially if you peel them?
This is really good for a pancreas.
If you peel them, it's got the right consistency too, right?
Yeah, right. It is true. The pancreas is one of these tricky organs. I'm sure everyone hears about the pancreas mostly when we think about pancreatic cancer, which is so bad. But there's an old saying in surgery, eat when you can, sleep when you can, and don't fuck with the pancreas. That's like if a pancreas gets messed with and it leaks, like you're in for a world of hurt. And pancreas transplant is the ultimate messing with the pancreas.
So the hardest organ to find was the liver.
Yeah.
So I can't, so it's not really the right shape, and usually only take half of it, right? So I thought maybe
cut it in half.
Maybe I don't know, but. No. Actually, don't do that. If you get crumbs on here, Debbie's gonna make me into an organ donor.
I don't want. I'm afraid if I take the knife and I'm shaking, people will be like, I don't want to. I love when I meet patients and say, "Hi, I'm Dr. Mezrich. It's good to see you."
Now, let's talk about so we talked about the technical and a little bit about immunologic, but the ethical things, like a heart transplant. So we're used to the debate between pro-life, pro-choice. When does life start, right? So we hear this. But for transplant surgery, especially for cardiac, it's when can you take a beating heart out of one person and put it in another? Because for a long time, we considered if you got a beating heart, you're still alive. Right. But when you take someone's heart out, that's going to be hard for them to...
They're definitely dead.
They're definitely dead. Right.
Yeah, so one of the things I love about transplant is it's filled with these incredible ethical conundrums that we have to deal with every day. Who gets a limited resource? Should an alcoholic get a liver? I think one of the biggest things is defining death. And a lot of people don't realize that transplant played a very big role in our current definition of legal death. And if you ask the average person on the street, how do you know when someone's dead? They'll likely say it's when their heart isn't beating, right? Now, this was a challenge for transplant early on. Now, when we were just doing kidneys in the 50s, people would actually wait till the heart stopped, till essentially it was a corpse or a cadaver, and then they'd take this corpse to the operating room and take out the kidney. When more complex organs started being transplanted, like livers and then ultimately heart, this became a real challenge because if you waited for the heart to stop beating, you can imagine that was going to be it was really going to affect the ability of the organ to start working. Yeah. So interestingly, in France, there was this concept of coma de passé, written about in the 50s, which was essentially the concept of brain death, but it wasn't really used as any type of legal definition. In the early 60s, a transplant surgeon from Belgium was at a meeting, and he brought up that when patients meet the criteria of coma de passé, they had been removing kidneys while the heart was still beating. And all the big wigs in transplant, including Joe Murray, Tom Starzl, Roy Collins, stood up and said, you're killing the patient, you can't be doing this. But Joe Murray, who was a kind of a great thinker and the most famous transplant surgeon in the world, was very nervous about how transplant was going to look, especially as heart transplants started coming around. Interestingly, there was a guy named Henry Beecher, who was an anesthesiologist and an ethicist at Harvard. And Beecher also was having challenges dealing with futility and patients in ICUs who didn't have any brainstem function, but yet they couldn't figure out when to stop treatment on these patients. So he ended up forming this committee at Harvard that included physicians, ethicists, clergy, to define this concept of brain death based on coma de passé. And the two people who ended up running this committee were Beecher and Joe Murray. You can imagine the kind of conflict there. I mean, Joe Murray was an incredibly wonderful and ethical person, but nevertheless, to have a transplant surgeon on the committee that defined brain death is a little bit fraught with challenges. They ended up publishing an article in JAMA which laid out or codified essentially brain death. And Joe Murray wanted to write that when you meet the criteria for brain death, he wanted to write, this is equivalent to death. And Beecher you have his notes, he crossed out death and wrote brain death. Now, it took some time for people, both physicians but also the public, to accept that brain death was a real thing. And over about a 10-year period, there were a bunch of surgeons that were accused of murder, even some that went to trial for murder for removing organs when a heart was still beating. But ultimately, around 1980, it was defined as a legal definition.
1980 is 13 years after the first heart transplant.
That's right. And in fact, the committee started codifying brain death right at the end of '67. They were talking about the committee, and then the first heart transplant by Christian Barnard happened in December of '67. Then a bunch of heart surgeons started doing heart transplants in '68. And the public started freaking out, like, my gosh, don't bring your loved one to the hospital because they'll take the heart out. Nobody minded when they took a kidney out, right? This is what pisses me off about you heart guys. Like, you know, people write songs about the heart. Nobody writes a song about the kidney. You know, I think Tim McGraw is here. I need to see if I can get him to write something about the kidney. But you know, like, that really gripped the public, not to mention all the heart transplants were doing terribly. And so it was really critical that brain death was defined. I think brain death has been this incredible gift to all of us because, obviously, transplant, that's one thing.
That's a bad soundbite.
I know, let me get the rest of it out. It has been this gift. And the reason I'll say that is, when you have patients in the ICU, a lot of times we'll kind of leave it to the family to decide when to withdraw support, when to stop care, when to keep going. And sometimes that's appropriate, sometimes that's not. But at least with brain death, we have this definition where you're able to say to families like, it's over, it's done. This person has, it's a line that's been drawn that's very clear. And to me, it's been this really great thing for families to be able to say to them, you know, your loved one is brain dead now, it's over. Now, there's been a lot of challenges to brain death lately because it was essentially defined by us, right? It's not some God-given definition or whatever you believe in. And there are many ethicists who say it's kind of made up, you should get rid of the term. And you know, then they say we should be able to take organs from people that aren't brain dead as long as there's consent. I think that opens a lot of can of worms that I personally am not dying to get into. I'm a believer in brain death. I get it's a line that was drawn, but I think all laws are lines that are drawn, and this is a good one.
Speaking of death and coming to the end,